Mr. Rudd, pleasure to talk to you again. I want to turn your attention to the big picture of the state of the world right now. Many believe that we are at a point where we are facing potential global catastrophic conflict in a way that we haven't seen since the end of the Second World War. Is that your assessment?
We are right now at quite a profound and deep international inflection point between the existing post-war global order to something where we don't quite know what the future rules will be. Why? Well, look, you've got illiberalism now re-breaking out in Eastern Europe. Look at what's happening, for example, in Hungary. You see illiberalism being articulated in some of the new politics that you see emerging in parts of the United States. You see also the forces of the far right, Alternative for Deutschland, and our own country, Hansenism, again raising their head. And so the domestic idea that free, open societies based on a free press and verifiable facts in media discourse is kind of becoming passé. That's a big problem. And secondly, on the question of open economies, well, you've got Her Britannic Majesty's realm, the Brits, deciding in their infinite wisdom to leave the European Union. So that's seeing a fracturing of one united, as it were, trade and economic order. But more broadly, you see the new protectionism being articulated by the United States. So much of what was constructed post-45 within our own camp
is being challenged.
Is challenged. Then you go to the China question.
Let's go to the China question. You've been focusing a lot on Xi Jinping as a leader. Many are saying the most powerful leader since Mao. And of course, he's leading a country now that was more powerful than when Mao was in charge. Is China a threat to the global order, or can the global order, given the challenges you've outlined, sustain and create space for a country like China that does not conform to the Western liberal democratic model?
Well, that, Stan, is the open question of our decade and the century.
Defining question of the
and what we've talked about now
But there are real fault lines here that could trip into conflict. South China Sea, China and Japan. This has real, live, hard consequences, this question, doesn't it?
It's no longer a seminar topic for a bunch of intellectuals hanging out in the common room at the University of Sydney International Relations Department. This is real stuff. So what do I see? First, China, in my study of the tradition through the course of my life, has a deep view of the rest of the world, which is it is always contemptuous of weakness and a respecter of strength. What China identifies, and I see this produced most days at the front page of the People's Daily, something which should be part of your daily reading.
It is.
Is one story after another about the internal implosions across the West. Democracy is not working. American shutdown. Then you have stories about retreat from free trade, Trump's protectionism, assaults on the United Nations, etc. So the Chinese leadership, which is an authoritarian leadership, saying to its own people at home, that model, which many of you have yearned for over the decades, ain't working. And then
we've got an alternative.
And then saying not just to themselves domestically, but also since the 19th Party Congress in October, November last year, to the rest of the world, there is another alternative model.
You raised a really interesting point a moment ago, and I want to go directly to this with Australia. You said China does not respect weakness. How does China see Australia? Does China respect our strength, or do they see us as potentially weak?
Now, that's a very big and provocative question, Stan Grant.
You probably have an answer for it.
And so let me try and duck and weave around it slightly. I can only answer for my own period in government, and I last was Prime Minister in 2013. I believe, though much criticised at the time, that we had got the balance right. We had disagreed with our Chinese friends on many things. We had disagreed with China on the South China Sea. We had disagreed with China on human rights in Tibet. Public disagreements with China on the question of the treatment of, say, Stern Hu, an Australian citizen found in the middle of the Chinese legal system. We had disagreed with China on certain of their proposed foreign investments in the Australian resources industry. And we disagree with China also on the role of Huawei, the Chinese telecommunications firm within the Australian national broadband network. Were these welcome news stories in Beijing? No, 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 and no. Did I get attacked regularly on the front page of the Global Times in Beijing? Yes. However, at the same time, we were able to maintain a normal political relationship with Beijing, get a whole bunch of stuff done, have a deepening security and political dialogue with the Chinese, advance our negotiations for the free trade agreement with China, but on the basis, I believe, of real, not notional, mutual respect. I was attacked routinely by Turnbull and the rest at the time for being too hard on China. I find that somewhat ironic in the current circumstances.
So do you worry that this government is seen as weak by China? Given that they've also spoken out about issues such as South China Sea and the disputed islands between Japan and China. They have stood up.
I'm not privy, obviously, to most recent intelligence reporting on what's happening in, let's call it, the deeper and darker dimensions of the relationship. So I'm always mindful of what I don't know in my current position. If I have a critique, however, of Turnbull, it's simply this. He's been all over the place. Absolutely all over the place. For example, on the question of domestic politics, there's one way in which you can close down much of the debate about foreign interference in Australian domestic politics, which is to pass the campaign finance laws, which I put into the Australian Parliament in 2008-9, which Turnbull refused to endorse or pass in the Senate, which explicitly banned all forms of foreign donations to Australian political parties. Had that been done in 2009, guess what? A lot of this debate would be just out the door. So I say to Turnbull, physician, heal thyself on this question. Just as Turnbull was then a very strong advocate of rolling Huawei, the Chinese state-related telecommunications company, the Australian National Broadcasting Network. And then you had people like Downer, for God's sake, a former Foreign Minister of Australia, on the Australian board of Huawei.
Well, there are many Labor politicians who've been doing business with China out of office.
But they seem to get a little more attention than some of the Conservatives that have been there. But I go to a national security point here. This is about the integrity of our national telecommunications system, national broadband network. We took a decision to exclude Huawei from being a provider. Let's have a little bit of accurate historical reflection here. I believe our government got the balance as right as any government can. It was not rosy with Beijing.
You are ducking and weaving.
No,
directly.
There's a caveat about what I don't know, Stan. There's a caveat about what I don't know.
Are we seen as fundamentally weak? And from what you're saying, the criticism of Alexander Downer on the Huawei board and the inconsistency you're alleging that Malcolm Turnbull is showing, that we are more vulnerable now and potentially seen as weak. Are we seen as weak by China?
What I cannot say in response to that right now is that I do not have access to the intelligence. That's a very reasonable position for me to take. Therefore, I do not know...
But the optics are?
I do not know formally, therefore, or informally, what the actual internal view of the Chinese government is in relation to the current government. So I'm just going to park that until I have a better evidentiary basis upon which to form a judgment. What I can say is that, from the public record, is that Turnbull has been all over the place on the question of the Australia-China relationship. Highly critical of me in the past for decisions like on Huawei. Highly critical in the past, for example, in terms of the robust posture adopted by our government on the question of the 2008 Defence White Paper and our first raising concern.
Where you really raised concern about China being a threat.
Yeah. About the South China Sea. So what I'm saying is Turnbull has gone from, he has blown hard and soft. He has blown from accommodation to confrontation. Now, what I'm saying is Australia's national interest demands consistency of a view. And we as a government had a consistent approach. And that consistent approach was anchored in a deep cabinet process in our government's national China strategy. This government does not exhibit evidence that it has one.
On the South China Sea, given what you've outlined, is that a tripwire for war? Do you believe that if a war was to begin, it would begin there? What's the potential for that?
The problem with how brittle the US-China relationship is at present, and it's getting more brittle as we speak, is that there are a number of tripwires which now exist. You have a more self-confident China. You have a range of a greater range of points of direct military intersection. South China Sea is one of them, and all the sub-scenarios within it.
Diaoyu, Senkaku,
Yeah,
with
and so
China
you've got
and Japan.
events, you've got incidents in the air, incidents at sea, and how can these be prevented from simply exponentially exploding from a minor bump into something much bigger. Then you have Taiwan. If you look at China's changing posture towards Taiwan, it raises a whole series of interesting parallel questions. And on the East China Sea, as you've just inferred, and then there's this whole rolling debate about near misses in overflight and by American intelligence and surveillance aircraft up and down the Chinese coast. Now this is happening every day of the week. And the question I have is, do we get to the stage when the other dynamics of the US-China relationship are so bad and so brittle that what might seem to be a manageable crisis suddenly escalates into something much bigger because all the other ballasts and supports for the relationship have fallen away? The US-China economic relationship is going to have its roughest time ever in 2018, and the first round of salvos has already been fired.
Mr. Rudd, good to talk to you. Thank you.
Good to be back in Oz.